Hello everyone. I can see people starting to join, so we'll give it a couple of minutes before we get into the really meaty discussion. But I'm really pleased to be in discussion today with some of our excellent colleagues from the AARP, Jean Accius, Peter Rundlet, and Kamili Wilson. They've got some really excellent things lined up to talk about. We're also really keen to take as many questions as we can. This is a great opportunity for all of our viewers to find out about the great work that AARP are doing, but also how it might apply to the work that you guys are doing in your own businesses and communities. So just a note on that before we get going, if you do have a question for our panelists or even just a comment that you'd like to make, there's two ways you can do that. The first is to use the raise hand function, which is at the bottom of your screen. So please just raise your hand, and when the moment is appropriate, I'll enable your microphone so that you can ask our panelists your questions directly. Please just give us some time. If you know, feel free to activate your raise your hand whenever you like. We might not come to you immediately, but rest assured that we will get to you. The other way that you can ask questions is just to use the Q&A function. So if you just type in your questions, if you prefer for your microphone not to be enabled, and then I can read them out and we can have a bit of a conversation about them. So look, thank you everyone for joining us, and thanks again to our panel. I'm going to hand over to Peter now, actually, for a brief opening framework about our topic of tackling ageism.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Peter Rundlet, and I'm really happy to be with you here today. When Angela asked us to moderate this debate on tackling ageism, I sort of laughed and said, well, who's going to take the other side? Obviously, no one is an advocate for age discrimination. And yet we know that biases and stereotypes that propagate a negative view of older people continue to persist. And in some instances, we have seen these biases emerge in policies that actually discriminate. And worse, in this country, we've even heard some outrageous statements by public officials, recently suggesting that older people have a duty to step aside, to sacrifice themselves in order to promote economic growth. In this era of pandemic, we will soon have to contemplate a time when societies are trying to reopen and people are starting to go back to work. Government officials and employers will have to grapple with tensions of public health, economic necessity, and how to protect vulnerable populations. As people do start to go back, it's possible that even well-intentioned employers might disallow workers over a certain age from coming into the workplace because older people are, on average, at greater risk. Clearly, these judgments are tricky, and employers will be simultaneously worried about their employees' well-being as well as their own liability if they get it wrong and they're unable to prevent their employees from getting sick. Obviously, these issues of ageism clearly existed before the pandemic. At AARP, as you will soon learn, we have been working for several years to disrupt aging, to challenge and change the way people think about aging, and to eliminate the everyday discrimination that remains so common in our societies. As people are living longer, healthier lives, some older people will want or need to work longer. This can give rise to the false sense that there's a competition for jobs and that younger workers are struggling to enter the job market because older workers are not retiring. The reality is that 2015 marked the first year in history that 5 generations of employees were working side by side in the US workforce. While the oldest of Generation Z are beginning their working lives as interns or entry-level employees, traditionalists and boomers are staying in the workforce longer than ever before. We believe this is an opportunity to be seized. Decades of research show that socially diverse groups are more innovative than homogeneous groups, and recent studies have found that the relative productivity of older and younger workers is higher in companies that have intergenerational teams. So how should we address these issues? Can new thinking, and perhaps even a new intergenerational social contract, help us move past these tired stereotypes and even help us see our new longevity as an opportunity that can be seized? What is required, and how can we begin to move in the right direction? These are some of the issues we want to talk to you about now. To lead our discussion, we have Dr. Jean Accius, Senior Vice President for Global Leadership, and Kamili Wilson, Vice President of Enterprise Initiatives at AARP. They will lead us on an interactive discussion, and we very much hope to engage with you on how we can tackle some of these issues and move forward together in a way that honors the dignity of people of all ages. To begin, We'd like you to think about what first comes to mind when you hear the word old, and we'd like to start with a quick poll.
So that's great. We've got quite an enlightened group, here, which we should have expected. So thank you, Peter, for that intro. I'm so glad to be with you all today. You know, that is why it's often when I go out and I talk about disrupt aging, we often start with a question: what comes to mind when you think about old? And no surprise with this group, the majority of responses spoke to experienced, but we also had some responses around elderly, as some other responses spread out, and that's, you know, no surprise. That's pretty typical in terms of, you know, when you ask somebody what is old, you're going to get different perspectives, and we talk about that at AARP largely because old is a social construct, right? It's aging that is a biological process that we all go through. And so it's important for us at AARP to really tackle head on some of the misperceptions around what old is, right? And how we can really shift to a more positive frame on aging. Because if we're all fortunate enough, we're all going to do it, right? So Disrupt Aging, as Peter mentioned, is several years old. It is one of AARP's signature initiatives and really inspired by the vision of our CEO. And it's a rallying cry, really, for all of us as citizens, as leaders, to challenge outdated beliefs and really drive for new solutions so that we can all live and age the way we want. And under the Disrupt Aging banner, AARP works with, we partner with organizations and individuals through social media, through research projects, events, thought leadership, and market innovation, and design challenges to really change and shape the future of aging. And because we're seeing that the population is aging differently, right? It's different. People are living longer, healthier lives, as Peter referenced, but our mindsets and the systems still continue to be out of sync with how more people are living and aging. And the stories we tell ourselves also haven't caught up with that. And the solutions are outdated or non-existent for this new longevity bonus that we're experiencing as a species. And we want to close that gap. We know it will require the effort of leaders across industries and sectors like the folks gathered here today, and that it's bigger than any one leader, any one organization. But we believe we can change the story and the reality of aging for future generations. And so we like to talk about disrupt aging through both kind of a personal, societal, and systems lens, right? And there's actually data that shows us that negative attitudes and perceptions around aging have real health implications. I'm sure most of the folks are familiar with the 2002 Becca-Levy study that shows that negative self-perceptions around aging can actually shave off 7.5 years of life. And so that's real data. You know, it's evidence-based that these negative sentiments are detrimental. We also have insights that show us it's detrimental, right? And there are all kinds of misperceptions at a societal level. And we have data that shows over the last 20 years, the word aging, there's been an increase of the use of the word aging as a synonym for decline. So it's become kind of pervasive and even the different forms of information that we consume. And so it's important that we understand the insidious nature of it and the implications. And then as Peter referenced, 2015 was the first year in the US of the 5-generation workforce. And so the answer is to know, how do we accommodate all of these different types of workers, all of this talent that we have in the workplace versus kind of feeding into the generational kind of competition. And there's a polling question that I think we want to pull up that also speaks to that there are systems implications to some of these negative thoughts and perceptions around aging. And we wanted to tee this one up. Angela, you've got it up there, that when older workers are discriminated against, the economy loses. And no one knows this better than my colleague, Jean Accius, who leads this work, that a new AARP report found that in 2018, discrimination against workers age 50 and older cost the US economy, and we'd love you to take a stab at what that number is.
Wow.
Yeah. So Jean, do you wanna to share kind of
Sure.
what?
So it's $850 billion in 2018.
Wow.
$150 billion, and we'll get into this, but so if you think about it, that in 2018, the economy would have, if you look at the total GDP, it would have been actually much higher. But because of age discrimination, we actually saw a significant loss of $850 billion, which is about 4% across many industries. So that's significant. And that was in 2018. So you could just imagine, in light of where we are today, what the implications could potentially be. And we'll get into this conversation, but I'm excited. And sadly, Angela would not allow us to vote. So I could not put in a vote for my response, but it's all good.
Yeah, so it is because of powerful insights like those that AARP is really so committed to driving this conversation around positive aging, inclusive aging, and it's not just in the workforce. We see really, as I said, all around us through images, through advertising, through marketing. And we know that in the US that it's actually our older adults who have the marketing influence, the buying power, who spend 56 cents of every dollar. And so we are actively working with the advertising industry here, who shapes so many of the images and the messages that we see and are bombarded with every day, and are encouraged about some of the incremental progress we're making. One of the things that we have undertaken is the power of image is so strong, and I'm sure folks are familiar with Getty Images, which is a global stock house. And one of the things that we wanted to do was actually start to change and shift the images that are associated with old and aging. And we did some research even before entering into Getty, where we did a Google search that overwhelmingly 70% of results came back just searching images when you put in old. Overwhelmingly, the images came back of individuals sitting alone. They're looking sad and frail, versus when you type in young, and the images actually come back with groups of people, vibrant colors. There was even a color palette of more pastels and muted tones associated with the search for old. And so we thought it would be very powerful. Again, there are people who are aging in decline and in frail, but more often than not, people are living longer, healthier lives. And the images that are available to us just don't reflect that. So we were really excited to launch the Disrupt Aging photo collection in 2019 with Getty Images as a way of showing more representative aging around the world. And so that's just one of the examples of how we think we can actively work with other entities to try to shift some of the narrative and imagery and perceptions around aging.
Thanks for that, Kamili. So we have a couple more polls lined up, but what's your preference, guys, on whether you're ready to take some questions from the group? Or Jean, I don't know if you wanted to feed in on top of what Kamili's been saying.
Absolutely. I'll kind of kick it off, feed into what Kamili's saying. And I see that Anna Dixon, I just put a note in the chat box that she found similar stereotypes in her research. So it'll be great to kind of hear some of Anna's thoughts in a few. But as I think it's so critically important, what Kamili's mentioning, what are the images that we see? How does those images help to inform or influence our own internal perceptions of aging? And how does that actually get translated out? Whether in terms of the products that are being designed, the policies that are being discussed. So there's a internalizing, but I also believe that there's a transformation so there's the pouring in and the pouring out, right? How does this get manifested in our policies that govern how we live and age in our societies? I think it's critically important. I saw a piece yesterday. I was reading an article, and the author started off with a very bold statement. And the author said, ageism is arguably the hardest to address because old age is neither a value of stage of life or an identity that many claim. So you have, it's such a powerful notion. So when we kind of think about ageism, and as Peter indicated, when we started to kind of talk about this, it was like, well, who's going to come in here and say, yeah, I'm for ageist policies? But I think it's more nuanced than that. I think it's more insidious than that. Because it's not that people are for age discrimination. It's just the fact that in some cases they may internalize the stereotypes, the off-the-cuff comments, and those off-the-cuff comments are in some ways translated into policies, programs, products, images, and it's self-perpetuating. So I would love to pick up on where Kamili left off, and I was struck by a presentation that Andrew Scott did last week, and he posed this question, and I think that's the question we want to pose to all of you, and then we'll really kind of get into this, and we want to hear from everyone about, to Kamili's point, these stereotypes. How do these stereotypes impact the way we live and age, both as an individual? What impact does that have on us in terms of our own healthy longevity, as well as in terms of how we govern with regards to our commitment for each other around particular social contract? So let's put up that poll, Angela. I would love to see what people respond with regards to this question. So do you agree that policies that require people over a certain age to continue to stay home should be used as countries start to re-emerge from the lockdowns? So this is a question that actually Andrew Scott raised last week on his panel presentation, and I was very surprised by some of the findings, in part because I'm a gerontologist, and I think that, like many of you, you're here, so you've self-selected to be part of this conversation. But it would be interesting to see your response to this question. So it looks like close to a quarter of folks who are on this call indicated yes, that age should be used as a criteria, and 76% of those on the call indicated no. Interestingly enough, when this question was posed last week, and maybe it's how the question is worded, it was 51 to 49.
Oh, wow.
So 51% of those who participated on the call with Andrew Scott last week indicated yes, that age should be used as a criteria with regards to the reentry and the reemergence of our economies across the world. And 49% indicated no. So I'm just curious, for those who are brave enough to want to kind of voice your thoughts with respects to this particular question, because this is a question, frankly, that is very current, that is timely, that is relevant both in terms of the public health space, but also, as Peter indicated, as well as in terms of the economic implications of this. So this is not just countries that are having to kind of think through exactly what their re-emergent or re-entry policies will be, but it's also employers. So just wanted to kind of see if anyone has any thoughts, any reactions to this particular poll, and then we'll continue the conversation.
So we do have, I'm sorry, please go ahead, Kamili.
I was going to just say, and also as I'd love to know what the audience thinks, and Jean, also too, in that question it raises for me, we also kind of framing the question that way, be perpetuating maybe some reverse age discrimination, right? Because we know that there are individuals across all levels who have compromised health and immunosuppressed systems, and just blanketly framing it according to age, I think really dismisses and undermines a bigger concern around at an individual level, that and the assumption that just people over a certain age, right, whether it be 50 or 60, are inherently at risk, when the reality is there are many people, individuals across ages who have other health concerns that make them vulnerable and should be a part of that consideration.
So we have some really excellent interactive chat happening. I have a couple of people hoping to speak, and then also some great conversation going on the chat for those who would like to check it out. But perhaps we'll start, if it's all right with you guys, we'll start with a comment from Anna. So Anna Dixon at the Centre for Aging Better. Anna, I'm just going to enable your microphone so that you can join us.
Hi, good afternoon, Angela.
Hi, Anna. Welcome.
Good morning to colleagues over in the States from AARP. Thank you so much for that really fascinating overview of some of the work that you've been doing in the States around ageist stereotypes and the great work that you're doing to disrupt aging. We commissioned a review looking at stereotypes here in the UK, and perhaps not surprisingly found very similar negative stereotypes. Both in the sort of, particularly in the health and social care domain, which I think has been further reinforced during the COVID, with this whole association of the elderly as vulnerable, association with death, decline, and poor health. And I think that has been a stereotype that's been somewhat reinforced. And the other is this sort of paternalistic othering. So we've called sort of this, picked up on this phrase that somebody else I think had used, doddery but dear. So there's a warmth in some of the stereotypes, but it is a patronizing. And again, the sort of language of some of the, even the government advice was rather othering, as if it was talking about people of a certain age rather than to them. That's the start of work that we're doing. The next phase has been to look at things like advertising, marketing, and policy. And I was very taken, Jean, with your points about not only is this damaging in terms of individuals, but it's also damaging in terms of societal response and policy response.
Right.
You know, if the focus is all on aging as a burden, pensions, health and social care expenditure, it leads us down a particular road. And if I can just be very naughty and give a plug for my forthcoming book on the age of aging better, which will be out in June, I try and tackle exactly these stereotypes around trying to reframe aging in terms of a society as something that could be positive if we take the right actions. And I think, you know, to just finish before we open up, I guess, for more discussion on your specific points about the lockdown, I think the issue here is obviously we have to go with science. We know there is an age-related risk, but we must also understand biological aging and those underlying processes which make people more at risk. And we know from inequalities in how people, in terms of health and healthy aging, that there will be people in their 50s and 60s in poorer communities who are extremely high risk. And it's really important that they are targeted with the appropriate messages to protect themselves and from this virus. So I'm done there, Angela. I hope that wasn't thanks.
Thanks, Anna. No, that was great. Would anyone from the, I'll take you off, Anna, but in just a moment, would anyone from the AARP team like to add any comments to that?
I just had a quick question of Anna. I don't know, Anna, if your survey results indicated some things that we might do to counter those sort of perceptions and stereotypes. What would it take for us to help do better at combating those?
So we're just finishing field work at the moment, which is testing out some of the more positive frames. Unfortunately, we didn't find any out there. Sometimes when you do this work, you find in a sense, a minority but positive one that it's about amplifying. I think here it's about creating a new framing and a new narrative, and something really about that being about the life course, that aging is a natural process and that we're all experiencing. And I think appealing to those sorts of values of, in a sense, universalism, we're all in this together, are beginning to emerge. But that is research that we are completing, and we would love to share with you and with others on this webinar who would be interested.
That would be great.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the things, Anna, that came up for me. I know Gene and his work to lead our thought leadership function, it often talks about the notion of life transitions, right, and life stages. And I'd love to hear your thoughts around a little bit more around how you think about maybe framing, moving away from kind of the young old binary, and really kind of talking more about how we experience life stages and life transitions, because there are so many more, I think, things that unite us and threads of commonality through the framing of life transitions than this binary that we're forced with through young and old. So have you spent time kind of delving into this notion, or I'd just love your thoughts around the concept of life transitions, framing our aging course through life transitions?
Kamili, I think you've really nailed it. This is absolutely about trying to get away from binary, intergenerational stereotypes, young versus old, and absolutely around recognizing that this is a life journey, that we're making transitions all the time. As an organization, Centre for Aging Better focus very much on the transition approaching later life, and about seeing the opportunities that we still have in our 50s and 60s to be able to affect how we will experience our later life. So it's all about that, and we've done specific work on the retirement transition and some of the ways that you can help people plan and prepare for that next stage of life. But yes, I don't want to give away, because the work is still going on to finish. So we haven't finalized some of the issues around that new framing, but it sounds like our research is leading us in a very similar direction to that which you are going in.
So what I love about this conversation is the fact that we are really driving towards this life stage concept. And as Anna indicated, and we've done some work here, even within the US, that there are certain triggers that may happen at any point in your life. And if you just take the chronological age, and I saw a comment here that 65 or 50, well, there's a lot that happens before you get to 65 or 50. A good example of this is thinking about caregiving. We just released a report last week that found that there's over 53 million family caregivers in the United States. Of that 53 million, nearly a quarter are millennials. So when we kind of think about the policies that we're creating, we got to really kind of put on a life stage perspective to ensure that we are addressing the needs of people across all ages. And then the other thing I would just say, because I think this came up earlier around particular issues around inequality, and this is the theory of cumulative disadvantage, that what typically happens in earlier stages of life can compound. So what you're seeing in old age is really a factor of that life course perspective. So what I'm hoping for, and what I really get excited about, and I can't wait to read your book, Anna, is how do we get that narrative outside of our choir? Right? Because what I thought was so intriguing by this question from Andrew Scott was that in many cases, I think this is a self-selected group who understands aging issues, right? And we can understand the nuances of what we're talking about. But we have a good group of folks who are in leadership positions, are making policy decisions that don't understand the nuances between a life stage and a chronological age, and providing guidance that can potentially have some unintended consequences that really kind of takes us down a certain path that's not necessarily helpful.
Thanks very much, Jean. We've got, and thanks very much, Anna. I'm going to take your microphone off. We've got so many questions coming in, both in the chat and with requests for verbal questions. The next person I'm going to come to is Mark Sackler. So Mark, I'm just going to enable your microphone now.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can. Okay.
So a couple of comments on ageism here. First of all, I'm going to be 70 this year. I am a member of the Association of Professional Futurists, and I embarked on the professional part of futurism at the age of 65. I started calling it a retirement career, but I don't call it that anymore because I have to be honest with you, my first comment about age stereotyping is I don't belong to AARP. And the reason I don't is one word, retired. My mantra is never retired. And I think as we live longer and longer, it's a new career, so to speak. And we'll get to the second comment that I'd like to point out, and that's the problem with age stereotyping and technology. I was had background in broadcast and print journalism earlier in my life, and now I write, I blog and podcast about the future at Seeking Delphi, and some of the participants, presenters in this conference have been on my podcast in the ending aging space. When it comes down to technology, if you look at some of the major technology sites on the internet, the futurism.com, Engadget, whatever, go to the Who We Are page and you'll see this beautiful panorama of diverse individuals, gender, race, ethnicity, but guess what? They're all under 40 years old. It's like there is a feeling that, you know, older people are clueless with technology, and some older people are. But of course, my argument is those of us who aren't have so much to add because you had the experience of all the change in technology we've seen in our lifetime. I'd be very curious to hear the panel's comments on that point. Thanks.
So Kamili, would you like to kick it off, and then I'll...
Yeah, a couple of reactions to that. I think, Mark, I hope you after we have a little bit of this conversation, you'll give AARP another thought, because you're absolutely right. It's why we actually really only reference ourselves as AARP and have for probably 15 years. Because we very much understand that the notion of retirement is a quickly fading one. And even our CEO has, when we talk about, you know, planning for retirement, right? We don't talk about planning for retirement, we talk about planning for life, right? And so we have to shift this mindset, right? Where we traditionally live this 3-stage life, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, and Andrew Scott has explored, from education, work, and retirement, to now where, you know, people will have not just multiple jobs, but multiple careers. And in terms of the vitality and the contribution of older workers, we know that the fastest growing group of entrepreneurs are over the age of 45. And it requires all a particular amount of technology savvy, to your point, in order to be able to implement and sustain those businesses, those startup businesses. So Mark, we absolutely agree with you on both of those points, and particularly around technology. I just read an article this morning in an HR publication that shows that us being forced to work remotely, workforces being forced to work remotely during Corona, has actually started to chip away at some of those stereotypes, because we're having to navigate technology in our homes so that we can connect now on a daily basis just to get our work done, and older workers are rising to the occasion. So both points well taken, and I'll leave it to Jean and Peter to add if they have anything.
Well, just a couple of things to add. One is that, Mark, after this, we're going to send you a wonderful AARP card because we definitely would love for you to be a member. But with all seriousness aside, I think that one of the things that we are trying to do as an organization is shift the mindset and the outdated model that life is linear, that you graduate from high school, you go to college, you get a job, you get married, you have kids, and then you work for one company until you quote unquote retire. We know that's not the case. People are living longer. They want to work or either need to work. There's economic benefits with working, but there's also health benefits with working. We know from studies that working provides people with a sense of purpose and a sense of meaning. And we can definitely get into some of the conversations around what AARP is doing around the future of work, as well as really trying to work with global companies to foster a multi-generational workforce. We've actually kicked off an initiative called Living, Learning, and Earning Longer, where we're actually working with the World Economic Forum and OECD to really highlight promising practices with global companies across the world around fostering a multi-generational workforce. What do companies need to do in terms of creating a culture that fosters that? How can they invest in their workplace, their workforce? And how can they ensure that both their employees and the employers are benefiting as a result? So it's a win-win proposition. The other thing I would mention very quickly is the fact that in light of COVID, as Kamili indicated, we're having to rethink the future of work, the future of workforces, and the future of workplaces in a very significant way. I think that COVID has accelerated significantly the wide use of technology and really having us kind of rethink about some of our systems. With regards to technology, one of the reports that we released last year is called the Longevity Economy. And the longevity economy had multiple goals. One was to show the economic contributions of the 50 plus, particularly in the US. And it was designed to really counter the narrative that older adults are a liability, that they are a decline, and really to show through numbers, through really compelling insights, how older adults provide tremendous value, both in terms of economic growth, as well as creating opportunities for all generations. And we were able to do this looking at the total economic value to the US economy, which was roughly around $8.3 trillion in 2018. And we were also able to project that out going all the way to 2050, which would account for the millennials, the Gen Zs, and different generations. But the key point here is the fact that we all also were able to look at different sectors and industries, and technology was one. When you look at how much the 50 plus population in the US spent in the technology space, it was roughly about $146 billion in 2018. And by 2050, it will be over $640 billion. That is significant, just in terms of the economic contributions. That's just that's the direct spend, as well as the indirects that come from that spending. And there's a ripple effect with regards to the number of jobs that are supported as a result of that spending and tax revenue that's actually generated. And part of what we're doing with the longevity economy work is basically working with these industries and sectors to really help shift their mindsets. Again, going back to our earlier conversation, the images we see, we internalize consciously or subconsciously. We're internalizing those images. And then those images and the values that we place on those images are in some ways getting translated into various policies, programs, products, whether it's intentional or not. Because, and Kamili's team did a beautiful video, it'll be great to kind of showcase this, where we actually asked some, I think it was millennials, what do they think about old?
What is old? It was like, what is old? Yeah.
What is old? And they had to act it out. You know, what you saw was the person walking very slow across the street, or the flip phone, which I actually think is coming back in style, by the way. But you saw these old images, the frailty, the decline, and we want to counter that. And I think the way that we're doing that is through some of the work that we've talked about today. But technology is a huge area of opportunity for us. And it's one that we see significant growth in, and probably even more so now in light of COVID.
And just to do a quick add on to that, and I'll let Angela come in with some questions. Jean talked about the Living, Learning, and Earning Longer initiative. And what we found is for employers, it's not as simple as just having a policy against age discrimination. What we really need is our age inclusive policy, so that you have employers beginning to think about, what do my employees need? And particularly as we see the workforce aging over time in many, many societies, including in the US, employers need to be thinking about flexible work environments, flexible workplaces, support for those who are caregivers, and things of that nature, lifelong learning, because as Jean talked about, you can't get your lifetime worth of education now in the first 2 decades and then hope it lasts for the next 8 decades. So these age-inclusive policies are much less common, actually. I think we found something like only 8% of employers, or some very low number like that, have age-inclusive policies. So that's something else we're working to promote.
Thanks very much, Peter. And thanks, Mark, for the question. Look, we're getting so many questions coming in, which is fantastic. I'm going to throw to Sandrine in just a second. Just a note to everyone who's using the chat, just to make sure, please, that you set to the questions to go to all panelists and attendees, just so that everyone can see as you're asking questions rather than just us on the panel. Following up on that, we have a question, just before I get to you, Sandrine, we have a question or a comment from Tom Hughes as well in the chat to the panelists, which I will throw to you, Tom, after we speak to Sandrine. So if you're still available and happy to do that, please just raise your hand so that we can do that next as well. All right, Sandrine, bringing you on in just a moment.
Can you hear me?
We can.
All right, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. My point, sorry, was a bit on the back of your the second poll, Jean. Just the point of that, how COVID-19 is probably going to affect older people's rights and choices, depending on what policies come into place. And I'm sure everyone here has probably read Being Mortal by Atul Gawande.
Yes.
But it just made me think of a quote from it that I actually have saved, and I'll just read it out because I think it might be quite relevant. He wrote, "We want autonomy for ourselves and safety for those we love. That remains the main problem and paradox for the frail. Many of the things that we want for those we care about are things that we would adamantly oppose for ourselves because they would infringe upon our sense of self." So it just brought that to mind. I thought very powerful words that I keep close and have definitely come to me during this time, because I've had to check myself, and I'm, I'd like to fight against ageism, and I've had to actually check myself about that. So I just thought I would say that.
No, thank you for sharing that. Big fan of Atul. I'll share with you. I used to work for a federal agency, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So in the U.S., this agency oversees 2 major social entitlement programs. One is Medicare, which provides health insurance for those over the age of 65, and then the other is Medicaid, which actually provides health insurance and as well as long-term care, particularly for low-income, vulnerable people, so across all ages. And I was a senior project officer in the Medicaid office, and I was reviewing a proposal from a particular state that's going to remain nameless. And I had the same reaction: independence versus risk and safety. And I remember talking to the leadership of that particular state about some of the concerns that we had with their proposal. And the reaction that we got was, well, what about the person's dignity of risk? If we are truly focused on people's values, preferences, should they not also be entitled to take on certain risks that comes with those values? And it was a huge moment for me as a public official, because again, some of these, not necessarily tensions, but to your point, as we're trying to do the right thing, what might be right for us might not necessarily be right for someone else. And really taking those nuanced approaches is very, very key.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks, Jean. Kamili or Peter, anything to add there before we throw to Tom?
Not for me.
No? Okay. So the reason that I wanted to bring Tom in is he's put some interesting questions in the chat. And I suppose to preface bringing him into the conversation, we're obviously addressing 3 fields with this conference: aging science, aging well, and longevity risk. And one of the reasons we wanted to do the 3 together was to make sure that those different communities, which within those different communities know each other very well, have a chance to cross-pollinate and share ideas. So Tom is from our aging science community, and I'm very interested to hear some of the feedback from the AARP team on some of his thoughts. So Tom, just enabling your microphone now.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been really, really interesting, and I think quite provocative as well. So yeah, I'm sort of from the gearhead tribe of this whole conference, but I was sort of reacting to that question that you had asked about whether or not people should be selected for quarantine because of their age rather than because of something else that actually might be more important. And I think this is something that, being somebody who's working and trying to develop new therapies for age-related disorders, I'm often struck by the idea that people are very, very willing to sort of dismiss the problems of aging because it's okay, because you're older, basically you should be sick. That's basically what we all expect. And the idea that one would simply lump risk of death or severe morbidity from COVID-19 into an age category rather than to really ask the question, what's the underlying problem? What's driving that increased risk of death as people get older? And I think it's pretty clear from a number of publications that the main drivers of comorbidities and death seem to be, comorbidities. So it's diabetes, respiratory illness, hypertension, all of which are actually interfacing with the underlying mechanism by which the COVID virus is working, by impacting ACE2 and its function, for example. But, I think we're leveraging that. So I just, I find it interesting, and I don't have any real wisdom to add to this except to say that I think we should resist the notion that we should bucket all people by age, rather than to look at what is actually happening under the hood and to make decisions that are evidence-based rather than sort of based on these types of biases. And I'll just close with one last comment, and that is that I recently went digging into the CDC's statistics on COVID and COVID-related mortality. And actually, if you just simply generate a ratio of people dying of COVID relative to dying of any endpoint, there's actually a peak that occurs at around age 35 to 45, and it doesn't change. So about 5% of people, no matter what their age, once they hit 35 years old, are dying of COVID. And so there's actually not this bright line for people in their 60s. It's just that more people are dying in their 70s and 80s and 60s than there are in their 30s and 40s. And so I think there's actually data out there today that might argue that it isn't about the age, it's about something else. And we probably already know what it is. So we should recast our quarantine perspectives on comorbid conditions, I think, rather than age itself. So anyhow, with that, I'll just stop talking and say again, thank you so much. It was a really wonderful panel, or it has been.
Thank you, Tom. Back to the AARP team, would you like to make any comments on that, or happy to move along? What are your thoughts?
I'd say, Tom's point is well taken. One of the things that we've been exploring at AARP through disruptation, but also through broader work, is disparities as they relate to age, health, and socioeconomic disparities. And while that racially, culturally, ethnically diverse populations disproportionately are experience underlying pre-existing conditions, comorbidities. COVID has only amplified it, right? These things existed before, these disparities, and they continue to exist. And we're seeing that certainly here in this country in terms of the communities that are being disproportionately affected. And so we want to take the opportunity to just kind of amplify that work and get at some of the root causes where we know that they're not, they didn't just come from COVID, but it's very much part of the current time and the current discussion to really shine a light, and to Tom's point, really focus on some of those underlying conditions that may have people presenting on being more vulnerable and susceptible because they do have these comorbidities. So it's, as Disrupt Aging, we started really, how do we have a positive aging conversation, where now also COVID is just kind of presented. We also need to tackle some of these root causes head on and directly, and COVID has amplified that for us.
Thanks very much, Kamili. And I think we have time for one more question, perhaps one that's come in on the chat, which is just around that 850 billion figure, and perhaps how we might be able to break that down, and some solutions for actually starting to chip away at that huge number. So who would like to sort of start out on that?
Sure, I'll kick it off. So we've been working with the Economic Intelligence Unit, which is a component of The Economist, on this major project. As I indicated before, when you look at the economic contributions of the 50 plus, particularly within the US, you're looking at about $8.3 trillion worth of economic activity. And that was in 2018. So if the 50 plus was its own country, it would be the third largest country in the world, right? So from an economic contribution standpoint. And what we did was said, well, what if there was no discrimination? What if we were to eliminate discrimination? How much would have that actually have been in 2018? And that's where we got the $850 billion from. And part of that is a combination of a couple of factors. One is the fact that we filled a survey of 5,000 people over the age of 50. Really getting as much information and insights about their economic situations as possible. And out of that survey, what we found was the fact that more than 6 in 10 of those workers reported that they either saw or experienced some form of age discrimination on the job. More than half of the older workers were either forced out of the job that they intended to retire from. And then 9 in 10 of those workers never matched their prior earnings, even if they can find a job again. So there's the impact of the actual cost of age discrimination. And then, of course, what does that actually mean with regards to being able to find other employment? So we took the insights from the survey work, and then we did some modeling work to control for some of the other factors that I think I saw in here. And that's how we were able to come up with the 850 billion. And I think part of that is something that Anna said earlier in terms of potential solutions, is to really kind of think about that, how age discrimination really hurts our economic growth, which impacts all of us. I think that's key. The other pieces to that is to understand that we are hopefully all aging. So we have to start to address some of these systematic and structural issues, both in terms of what's happening in the workplace, but also through the work that we're doing with some of our employers. What language are we using? Which is why I really love that first polling question. Because if we're indicating in job applications that we're looking for a digital native, young and vibrant applicants should apply, that sends a certain message. The other aspect of that too is the fact that to what extent are we creating and ensuring that that we pretty much have ageless policies as well as ageless benefits, if we truly believe in this life stage perspective, which I think is key, because it's not necessarily about chronicle age. So from a solution standpoint, there's policy and advocacy work, particularly at AARP, that we've been doing, both in terms of the advocacy work to ensure that age discrimination doesn't actually exist, that we can actually reduce that in a significant and meaningful way. We've also have a litigation arm who's been extremely active in this space. Because it's key. We're seeing this across industries and sectors. And then, of course, I think we continue to need to do more of the due diligence, as Peter indicated in our opening. It's not as if, people are outright saying they're against people because of a certain age. It just so happens that some of the policies, whether it's intended or unintended, and some of the practices has that effect. So how do we start to tackle that? And AARP has been doing a lot of work, particularly with the World Economic Forum and OECD through this Living, Learning, Earning Longer initiative, to really identify ways in which we can ensure that more companies are incorporating age as part of their diversity inclusion policies. And in fact, we did a survey of 1,700 global companies from 8 different countries. And one of the things that came out of that survey, and this was with C-suite executives, was that these companies and these leaders wanted more information about creating age-inclusive policies and practices. So I do think that that's an opportunity for all of us.
That's right. And where my colleagues, Jean and Peter, focus on policy implications and how we get at it through policy, I hope that, the work that we're doing through Disrupt Aging, through the imaging and the language, right, complements that. Because as we kicked off by saying, we're just constantly surrounded and bombarded by images and messages that reinforce that aging is a negative thing to be feared. And we know increasingly, just through this conversation, the folks that we've engaged, the data that's out there, that there really is more opportunity that comes along with aging. And so how can we really be more focused on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really inside of all of us. Years ago, if someone mentioned a doctor, you thought of a man. And through constant messaging and learning, you realize, no, wait a minute, it could be a man or a woman. We all grow up with a sense like you retire at a certain age and then like you're really no good anymore. And so all of us need to be really persistent in really getting at these cultural images that are all around us and inside of us to really promote a different view of what it means to grow older and what you can do as you grow older.
No, Peter, you're absolutely right. Because I remember when I was in grad school, and I'm a social gerontologist, and I remember we were talking about the social disengagement theory. So for those, I'm sorry if I'm going very wonky real quick, but the theory here was the fact that at a certain age, older adults just disengage from society, that they just really kind of step back and sit on their rocking chair and just, I don't know. They just, and just wait until the end. And I just remember having a very strong reaction to that cannot be what life is all about. That at some point in time, you just say, you know what, I'm going to step back. I'm going to totally disengage from society. I'm just going to sit out here and just wait until my time comes. I mean, there's so much more to life. And I think that's part of the conversation we've been having today. That's right. That's a great point there, Peter.
Thank you so much. Well, look, we're coming to wrap up now. I just wanted to make a note for everyone. I can see there's been so much chat and so many questions put forward. So there's a couple of ways that you can get in touch with the AARP folk if you'd like to continue this conversation. The first is you can search for our panelists directly in the delegate list, which is off the main navigation page. If you go to your top right-hand corner, there's a search function to look through. So you can message people directly if you'd like to continue the conversation or put some more questions to our panelists. The other thing is we're actually coming up for 3 o'clock. We're about to go into our exhibition tour. So I would encourage everyone who has enjoyed this discussion to visit the AARP booth in the virtual exhibition, which again, you can find navigating from the main page. And that's a manned booth. So you can put any questions, you can find out some more information, you can get in touch with the organisation that way as well. In the meantime, I would like to say thank you so much to our excellent panelists. That was such an engaging discussion, and this past hour has just flown by. I don't know if that's the same case for everyone else. And thank you as well to everyone who participated in the chat and joined in for the discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but I'm glad that we managed to cover off a significant number of them. So thank you once again, Jean, Kamili, and Peter, and thank you everyone for listening.